This is a trite truism. There is no simple answer to a subject as complex as prostitution. And suffice it to say that we are focusing and will be focusing in this legislation on not only acting in the best interests of the vulnerable and Canadians, but also there will need to be support mechanisms outside the legislation. Look, we've looked at a lot of different options and a lot of different models. The Nordic model is one. I can assure you of this, it'll be a Canadian solution.
Well, it is the oldest profession in the world, and we're still trying to figure out how to handle it and how to deal with it. And of course, you've just seen Canada's Justice Minister Peter MacKay, who's somewhat confounded by how a Conservative government is going to rewrite Canada's prostitution laws. Let's bring in Sun News contributor Ed Prucci, of course, also with crimlawcanada.com. I say confounded because I think that really very much describes what's happening here. You have a Conservative government who, by all measures, wants to, push family values and things like that. But then the Supreme Court ruling says, you have to rewrite this, you have to get this done within a year. So here we are now. What do you think that the feds can possibly do to appease not only their political base, but also a very vocal minority of women who've been fighting for this at the Supreme Court level?
Right. It's a really tall order, and almost certainly
And you haven't figured it out, Ed?
I can't promise you that I've got it all sorted out. In fact, we saw in that clip, we saw the minister play it very cagey. I mean, people have been pushing him for some time to give us some hint about where the government is headed. Some things we do know, they're not looking at a bylaw type of regulation or decriminalization mechanism. They've been very clear. There are going to be criminal code amendments. It's going to be criminalized in some way, shape, or form.
Okay.
It's going to be quote unquote uniquely Canadian. I don't honestly know exactly what that means.
They're going to ask
what that's
politely?
a reference to. Right. We'll say please. We'll use parkas.
Sure.
I don't know exactly where that gets us.
Okay.
But what the smart money is on is this Nordic model, where a number of countries have tried to adopt that as an alternative, and that involves going after not the women who sell sex predominantly, but the men who buy it.
Okay, so it's something from Sweden, Iceland, and Norway.
Right.
It's been written about extensively and discussed extensively, and as you say, the Nordic model. So selling sex in those jurisdictions is legal, but the purchasing of it is illegal. So focusing on the pimps and the Johns in that regard. But if you are someone in the industry and you choose to take this up and you live your life as a prostitute, yet the people who are paying you your salary ostensibly, Ed, are the ones that are being
by very nature, those people are criminalized.
How does this work?
Well, the idea, of course,
I don't understand.
The idea, of course, behind that model is to still stop prostitution, but to stop it in a way that is minimally harmful, if I could put it that way, to the women who are involved in selling it. Now, let's keep in mind that one of the key women behind the attack that went all the way to the Supreme Court and succeeded, Miss Bedford, she's not the kind of person who was pressured into going into the prostitution industry, and in many respects is not your typical, if I can put it that way, prostitute. She ran a dungeon, a bordello, a body house, those types of things, and she's made it very clear and has spoken out a number of times that that's what she still wants to do. So if we go into a Nordic model style of legislation that says we're going to criminalize the purchase of it, even though she may not be committing a criminal act, although she might be depending on how it's phrased, her customers would potentially become criminals, and that's not what she wants to see happen. And she said, I'll go back to court and I'll fight that.
Yeah. What are the options, though, as far as so the federal government has to rewrite the law because it's a federal law.
That's right.
But when it comes to cracking down, as it were, on the pimps and the Johns, for example, for argument's sake, say it's Nordic model-esque, Ed, that's up to the municipalities, because that's the local police services then, Ed, that are going to have to be responsible for keeping their eye out on that. So there's got to be a lot of discussion between all levels of government.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's a rift that is consistent throughout the criminal law process. Because the Criminal Code of Canada is a federal statute, it's always the feds in Ottawa who decide what is illegal, what the punishments are for that, and why. And yet, ultimately, enforcement of the law falls very much to the provinces and ultimately to the cities that they then delegate their police forces to. So So it's going to be municipal and provincial police forces that ultimately have to make arrests, and it's going to be our provincial courts and largely our provincial jails, except in extraordinary circumstances where really high federal sentences are imposed, that pay the price. So this disconnect is not unique to the sex industry, but it's a problem throughout criminal justice.
It's a good point, because we're always talking about how much it costs, for example, to house prisoners, and to pick your level of government, for example. But we also have this constant disconnect between the different levels. What is written in a federal statute and in practice is completely impractical in some cases. So the system could be clogged up more than it already is with infractions such as pimps and johns being picked up for trying to solicit, trying to buy prostitution. Some would argue, okay, that's fine because they're breaking the law, so we have to crack down on them. But do they change? I mean, I guess they can change how long they go to jail or what the infraction is. Is it a fine? All these things are yet to be sorted out. But we're getting close to the summer, and
we are starting to run out of time a little bit.
The weather may not tell us that, but if we're getting close, and so McKay is. I mean, he's really got an uphill battle here.
Well, he has a deadline, very much so, because we know that the Supreme Court only gave him 1 year before that declaration of invalidity. That's what happened at the Supreme Court, that basically tossed wholesale all of our prostitution laws out to the curb. That's going to come into effect about mid-December, if I recall correctly. So not only does he have to get the legislation in place, it has to be passed, it has to be confirmed before the Senate, and it has to be in place in Parliament in order to be ready to go. Otherwise, there's going to be this gap in the law at that point. Now, I mean, the practical implications of that are probably not as serious as they sound, since already at this point we're in this vague sort of limbo type scenario where I think some police forces have made the decision, maybe not explicitly, but already to say, you know what, we're not getting into this mess until we know what the law actually is. But of course, we're almost certainly headed towards another challenge. I mean, depending on what the government comes down with, as you indicated right off the bat, it's not going to please everybody. There's no doubt about that. Some people are going to say it's not hard enough. Some people are going to say it's too hard, and we're likely to see further challenges. So we're not out of this mess for quite some time, and how it's going to shake down depends very much on what procedure the government decides to put in place. There are no easy answers. That's what Mr. McKay said right off the bat.
And he's right. I don't envy him in this position because it is a very difficult one, but we're going to have to leave it there. Appreciate your thoughts on this. Thanks very much.